Here is a belief so deeply embedded in the culture that most people have never once stopped to examine it. The belief that poverty is primarily an economic problem, that it is fundamentally a question of money, too little coming in, too much going out, a math problem with a math solution. Get people more money, or better yet, help them develop the skills and habits that lead to more money, and the problem resolves. Simple, logical, almost entirely wrong. Poverty is not primarily an economic condition. It is a biological one. It is a specific, measurable, physiologically destructive state that gets inside the body, rewires the brain, shortens the telomeres, elevates the glucocorticoids, suppresses the immune system, and alters the developmental trajectory of every organ system in ways that persist for decades and in some cases across generations. Money is the mechanism of poverty. Biology is the damage. And until we understand the damage at the level of tissue and neuron and hormone, we will keep designing responses to poverty that address the mechanism while completely missing the wound. So let's talk about the wound. Start with stress. Not the kind of stress you feel before a presentation or during a difficult conversation. The acute, time-limited, episodic kind that the stress response was actually designed to manage. The kind of stress produced by poverty is categorically different. It is chronic, uncontrollable, unpredictable, and inescapable. And those four characteristics are not just descriptions. They are, as it turns out, the precise variables that determine how damaging a stressor is at the biological level. Decades of research on stress physiology, much of it originating in animal models and then confirmed with striking consistency in human populations, has established that the most damaging stressors are not necessarily the most severe in absolute terms. They are the ones that are uncontrollable and unpredictable. A stressor you can see coming and do something about activates the stress response, but also activates the coping circuitry, the prefrontal systems that allow you to plan, act, and resolve the threat. A stressor that arrives randomly, that you cannot predict, and that you cannot control or escape activates the stress response without activating the coping circuitry. The body mobilizes for action that is never available. The cortisol surges and does not resolve because the threat does not resolve, because there is nothing to do that will make it stop. This is the neurobiological signature of poverty. Not just financial scarcity, but the specific texture of that scarcity. The unpredictability of whether there will be enough money for food at the end of the month, the uncontrollability of systems, landlords, employers, creditors, government agencies that have enormous power over your life and that you have almost no power over in return, the inescapability of a situation that is not a temporary crisis, but a permanent condition. Each of these characteristics independently amplifies the toxicity of the stress response. Together, they produce a glucocorticoid environment that is among the most biologically destructive that a human body can experience over the long term. Let's follow the cortisol into the brain, because that is where the most consequential damage accumulates. The hippocampus, as we have established in other contexts, is densely packed with glucocorticoid receptors and exquisitely sensitive to sustained cortisol elevation. Chronic poverty-related stress produces measurable hippocampal atrophy, reduced volume, reduced dendritic, complexity, impaired neurogenesis. And because the hippocampus is central to memory consolidation, spatial reasoning, and the regulation of the HPA axis itself, this damage has cascading consequences. Memory gets worse. The ability to learn from experience degrades, and the brake on the stress response becomes less effective, meaning cortisol levels stay elevated longer after each stressor, meaning more hippocampal damage, meaning a less effective brake in the self-amplifying loop that chronic stress reliably produces. The amygdala, meanwhile, is doing exactly what sustained glucocorticoid exposure tells it to do, which is grow larger and become more reactive. The threat detection system expands. Sensitivity to potential danger increases. The threshold for triggering a fear or aggression response drops. A world that was already genuinely threatening becomes neurologically encoded as even more threatening. because the brain doing the encoding has been structurally modified by years of operating in a high-threat environment to see threat more readily and more intensely. And the prefrontal cortex, the regulatory hub, the seat of impulse control and long-term planning and nuanced decision-making, loses synaptic density and functional connectivity under sustained glucocorticoid exposure. The capacity for exactly the kind of thinking that would theoretically allow someone to plan their way out of poverty, future-oriented, consequence-weighing, impulse-regulating executive thinking, is biologically compromised by the conditions of poverty itself. This is not a coincidence or an irony. It is a mechanism. The environment damages the tool most needed to escape the environment. Now here is where something important needs to be said, because there is a version of this argument that slides, without anyone quite noticing, into a kind of biological fatalism. The idea that poverty damages the brain, and therefore poor people are cognitively impaired, and therefore nothing can be done. This is not the argument. The brain is plastic. The damage is real, but not necessarily permanent, particularly with early intervention. And the argument is not that poor people have worse brains. The argument is that poverty produces specific neurobiological conditions in anyone's brain, and that those conditions have predictable behavioral and cognitive consequences that we have been systematically misattributing to character rather than to cause. The research on cognitive bandwidth is particularly clarifying here. A series of studies conducted across multiple countries examined the cognitive performance of people under conditions of financial scarcity versus financial security. What they found was striking. The same individuals performed significantly worse on tests of fluid intelligence, working memory, and executive function when they were in periods of financial stress compared to when they were not. Indian farmers, tested before and after harvest, poor before, relatively flush after, showed IQ differences of approximately 13 points between the two conditions. Not different people, the same people, in different financial circumstances, performing at measurably different cognitive levels. 13 IQ points is not a small difference. It is the equivalent of a full night of sleep deprivation. It is the cognitive penalty imposed automatically and invisibly by the mental burden of managing scarcity. When your mind is occupied with the continuous low-level calculations of financial survival. Can I cover rent and food, or just one of them? Which bill can I delay? What happens if the car breaks down this month? Those calculations are consuming working memory and executive resources that are then unavailable for other cognitive tasks. The bandwidth is finite. Scarcity consumes it. And the cognitive performance that remains is what poverty critics then point to as evidence of the poor decision-making and short-term thinking that supposedly explains poverty in the first place. The causal arrow is running in exactly the wrong direction in the popular imagination. It is not that people make poor decisions because they are poor thinkers. It is that poverty itself degrades the cognitive architecture that good decision-making depends on as a direct and measurable consequence of the mental load that scarcity imposes. The poor decision is a symptom. Poverty is the disease. Let's push this further, because the damage does not begin in adulthood. It begins before birth. Maternal stress during pregnancy elevates glucocorticoid levels in the intrauterine environment. The developing fetal brain, with its rapidly proliferating neurons and its exquisitely sensitive hormonal environment, is exposed to those elevated glucocorticoids during critical windows of development when the architecture of the HPA axis, the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the prefrontal circuitry are being established. Research in both animal models and human cohorts has shown that prenatal stress exposure alters the calibration of the developing stress response system, essentially setting the HPA axis to a higher baseline, producing an individual who is, from birth, more stress-reactive than they would otherwise have been. The volume on the threat detection system is turned up before the child has taken a first breath. The prefrontal regulatory circuitry is set to develop in a hormonal environment that compromises its architecture before the child has made a single decision. Then comes early childhood. The first few years of life represent a period of extraordinary neural plasticity. The brain is growing faster than it will ever grow again, laying down the synaptic architecture that will form the foundation of cognitive and emotional function for decades. The experiences of these years, the quality of caregiving, the predictability and safety of the environment, the nutritional adequacy, the presence or absence of chronic threat, leave lasting structural marks on hippocampal and prefrontal development. Children growing up in poverty are disproportionately likely to experience exactly the conditions that compromise this development: unstable caregiving driven by parental stress, food insecurity, exposure to violence, housing instability, environmental toxins including lead, which has its own devastating effects on prefrontal development, and the chronic activation of their own nascent stress response systems in environments that are genuinely and continuously threatening. By the time these children enter kindergarten, the neural architecture they are bringing to their first educational experiences has already been significantly shaped by years of poverty-related stress exposure. The differences in school readiness between children from low-income and high-income backgrounds that are visible at age 5 reflect, in substantial part, differences in the neurobiological environments those children's brains developed in during the preceding 5 years. We then assess these children using standardized metrics, identify the gaps, and frequently respond with interventions that focus on the children's behavior and effort rather than on the biological conditions that produce the gaps. We tell 5-year-olds, in effect, to try harder, with their compromised prefrontal cortices, in environments that are still producing the cortisol that is still doing the damage. There is also the matter of what poverty does to the immune system, because the biological consequences extend well beyond the brain. Chronic stress suppresses immune function through multiple mechanisms. Glucocorticoids are powerfully immunosuppressive, which is why synthetic versions of cortisol are used medically to suppress inflammation and immune responses. Sustained elevation of endogenous cortisol therefore compromises immune surveillance, reduces the effectiveness of vaccination, slows wound healing, and increases vulnerability to infection. People living in poverty are not just more exposed to pathogens through crowded housing and inadequate sanitation. Their immune systems are also biologically less equipped to fight those pathogens because the chronic stress of poverty has suppressed immune function at the cellular level. The telomere data adds another layer of biological aging to this picture. Telomeres are the protective caps on the ends of chromosomes, and they shorten with each cell division as a normal part of aging. Chronic stress accelerates telomere shortening, essentially accelerating biological aging at the cellular level. Studies consistently show that people living in poverty, and particularly people who experienced poverty in childhood, have shorter telomeres relative to their chronological age than people from more affluent backgrounds. Poverty ages people, not just in the way that hardship is metaphorically aging, but in the literal biological sense of accelerating cellular senescence. The body of a 50-year-old who grew up poor may be biologically older at the level of DNA than the body of a 50-year-old who grew up wealthy. Now sit with the full picture for a moment. Poverty produces a specific glucocorticoid environment that damages the hippocampus, expands and sensitizes the amygdala, compromises prefrontal connectivity, suppresses neurogenesis, depletes cognitive bandwidth, suppresses immune function, and accelerates cellular aging. It begins doing this in utero, continues through early childhood during the most critical windows of neural development, and persists across the lifespan in ways that compound over time. The people experiencing these biological consequences are simultaneously navigating environments that are genuinely more threatening, more unpredictable, and more uncontrollable than those of their more affluent counterparts, which means the stressor inputs producing the biological damage are not just a matter of perception or attitude. They are real. The threat is real. The uncontrollability is real. The biology is responding appropriately to actual conditions. And what does society do with the behavioral and cognitive outputs of this biology? It observes the impaired executive function and calls it laziness. It observes the heightened threat reactivity and calls it aggression. It observes the short-term thinking produced by bandwidth depletion and calls it irresponsibility. It observes the difficulty with future-oriented planning produced by prefrontal compromise and calls it lack of ambition. It attributes to character what is in fact the predictable behavioral signature of a specific biological state produced by specific environmental conditions. And then, having misidentified the cause, it designs interventions accordingly: character-building programs, behavioral incentives, personal responsibility campaigns that address the misidentified cause while leaving the actual biological mechanism entirely untouched. This is not a small error. It is perhaps the central error in how wealthy societies think about poverty and the people living in it. And it is an error with enormous consequences because it means that the resources and interventions directed at poverty are systematically aimed at the wrong level of the problem. You cannot bootstrap your way out of a compromised hippocampus. You cannot develop grit with a prefrontal cortex that chronic glucocorticoid exposure has structurally diminished. You cannot close an achievement gap that is rooted in differential brain development by telling children to work harder with the brains that differential development has produced. What the neuroscience of poverty actually demands is intervention at the biological level, reducing the glucocorticoid burden that is doing the structural damage. That means reducing the unpredictability and uncontrollability of poor people's environments, because those are the specific stress characteristics that are most biologically toxic. It means stable housing, because housing instability is one of the most powerful chronic stressors in the taxonomy of poverty-related threats. It means food security, because food insecurity is a continuous, uncontrollable stressor with direct neurobiological consequences. It means early childhood intervention beginning before birth, because the developmental windows during which stress does the most lasting damage are the earliest ones. It means treating the maternal stress of poverty as a prenatal health issue, because the intrauterine glucocorticoid environment is shaping the stress response architecture of the next generation. None of this is politically simple. None of it fits neatly into existing frameworks for thinking about poverty and personal responsibility and the role of government and the limits of intervention. But the biology does not particularly care about political frameworks. The hippocampus does not shrink differently depending on your theory of poverty. The cortisol does not discriminate between ideologies. The telomeres shorten at the same rate regardless of whether you believe poverty is primarily a structural or an individual problem. The science has told us, with considerable precision and remarkable consistency, what poverty is doing to human biology. The question of what we choose to do with that information is a different kind of question entirely. But we cannot claim any longer that we do not know what is happening. We know exactly what is happening. We know it at the level of the neuron and the hormone and the chromosome. We know when it starts and how it compounds and what it produces decades later in the behavior and health and cognition of the people we then look at and ask why they are not doing better. The most toxic stressor known to science is not a pathogen, not a toxin, not a traumatic event. It is a condition, a chronic, uncontrollable, unpredictable, inescapable condition that gets inside the body and rewrites the biology from the inside out. We have been calling it an economic problem for a very long time. The neuroscience is suggesting with considerable urgency that we might want to rethink that.